Good afternoon, everyone. Before I introduce Jill and have you hear of all the great things that are happening at the center, I did want to take 1 minute of her time and give you some brief historical context to her remarks and perhaps why they should be important to Atlanta Rotary, as Stephanie said. The center is in its 8th year of operations, a rather young institution, but its germination began more than 20 years ago when a collection of civic leaders began calling for a creation of a new facility that would reflect on our past, inform the present, and influence the future of the enduring story of civil rights and human rights. Some of those leaders are here with us today. Others have sadly passed on, like Mrs. Evelyn Lowry and Congressman Lewis, to name just a few. So I believe it's important to recognize those pioneers who've been championing this cause for a couple of decades now. Feels like longer than decades. We are fortunate to have our chair, our only chair since the creation, and that would be the irreplaceable Shirley Franklin. Other board members who happen also to be Rotary members, the famous Egbert Perry, I saw Egbert someplace, and Curly Dossman. Is Curly here? And our city councilman, Doug Shipman, who was our first CEO, who took the job on a 1-year assignment that lasted 7 years. And a special shout out to our own Maria Saporta, who wrote very early about the need to create the center and continues to be a positive supporter of all of our work. Now, just on a personal note, and as a veteran of many years embedded in downtown civic matters, I honestly can say that the center has been one of the most important, if not the most important, civic creation of this era. And that's with a whole lot of other competitors: stadiums, Centennial Olympic Park, the Beltline, airport expansions, and many more. Now, why is this? Because this institution represents the very soul of Atlanta, what distinguishes us from all other cities, and truly gives us the identity that no other city can claim. And with that, let me say a few words about Jill. Jill is the president and CEO of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, is a human rights advocate with extensive experience in genocide and atrocity prevention. She assumed this leadership role in March 2019, just right before COVID, but has been involved with the center since 2010 when she curated the center's exhibit on global human rights before the center's opening in 2014. Previously, Jill was the acting director of the Simon Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Before that, she was senior advisor at the museum. In this role, she curated the museum's Wexner Center, which presents exhibitions about contemporary genocides, served on the team working to revitalize the museum's permanent exhibition on the Holocaust, and manage a range of public education initiatives. Way back in 2007, Jill founded and directed Dream for Darfur, a high-profile advocacy campaign that pressed the Chinese government to take specific actions regarding the Darfur crisis in the lead up to the 2008 Beijing Games. Dream for Darfur was widely recognized for influencing the Chinese government to change its policies on Sudan in the lead up to the 2008 Olympics. Jill was also the director of campaign at Human Rights First from 2001 to 2007. She developed a campaign that recruited retired military leaders to bring U.S. policies on torture and interrogation into compliance with U.S. and international law. Earlier, she was the communications director for the Ms. Foundation for Women, where she ran the successful Take Our Daughters to Work campaign. Jill taught for 3 years a course on human rights advocacy at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, and began her career as a reporter of WAMU, is that WAMU? The NPR affiliate in Washington, D.C. She graduated summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa from Yale University, and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Please give a warm Rotary welcome to Jill Savitt.
Thank you, AJ, for that introduction and so much more. And thank you to Stephanie and Rotary for inviting me to speak today. It's a pleasure to be here. And also to our board chair, welcome to Shirley. I know many of you have been a part of the center's life since it was just the spark of an idea, before Dr. King's papers were purchased, before construction, and before our opening. And some of you were really critical to ensuring that we became a reality. So before I jump into my remarks today, I wanted to give you a quick update on where we are. Since we opened 8 years ago, we have become very good at serving as a dynamic and powerful local attraction. With that securely in place, we are in the midst of a significant transition that will help fulfill the mission of those founders that AJ talked about. That means we are evolving from a powerful Atlanta attraction to a national cultural institution focused on rights. To do this, we are expanding both our building and our programs. So you all know this is us today. And this is what we'll look like in 2 years. You'll see that there is a new 3-story wing on the west, on the left, and that will host 3 new galleries, including one for families with kids under 10. It will have a cafe with outdoor seating, and this will open us up to an audience that we currently don't serve, but who is out there on Pemberton going to the World of Coke and the aquarium. So we'll be able to invite in families and children and talk to them about building a world where human dignity is protected. The 1-story East Wing, you see that from Ivan Allen, that's going to double our event space to 10,000 square feet with classrooms and meeting rooms and space for performances and conferences. We're also refreshing our current galleries, including doubling the number of seats at our signature and powerful lunch counter experience. This expansion is not only going to help us fulfill our mission, it will also help us to become more financially self-sufficient. Our plan is to break ground this fall and open our new wings for our 10th anniversary in June 2024. So to date, we have raised $29 million for the new wings, and we are in active discussion about 10 million more, which will leave us with about 8 million to raise. So as you can imagine, I would be delighted to talk to anyone who is interested in learning more about our capital expansion. In addition to the capital funds, we've raised $8 million to expand our programs to help us become a truly national organization with Atlanta as the wind in our sails. So we're putting these resources to a variety of programs. We're making a huge investment in K-12 education. We believe that the center can be the premier civil rights educator in the country, and because of our home base here in Atlanta, we should be. We've created a DEI experiences program for workplaces. I see some of our clients here today, where we talk about what it means to create an inclusive culture in the workplace and why that's so important. Sorry. We also have a human rights and law enforcement training program. I see Dave Wilkinson here. He's been a huge partner in that. We have trained all of the Atlanta Police Department in this human rights course and have had enrollment from 18 other cities around the country in our course. We have an LGBTQ institute that looks at the particular threats, both legislative and physical, to LGBTQ Southerners. And we have a program called Truth and Transformation. That program is what I'm going to spend the most time talking about today. It's a program that looks at truth and history, and specifically about how engaging in a fuller historical conversation about civil rights is essential to building a future that is more fair and more just for all Americans. But before we talk about the future or dig around in the past, I want to spend just a minute or so on the present. I have conversations about race every day, and they can be awkward and they can be painful. People get worried about offending, and they get worried about being offended. It's important to have grace with each other when we have these conversations, and that is standard operating procedure at the center. If these conversations weren't tough enough, we are having them against a backdrop of extreme polarization in our country. The furthest ends of the political spectrum have dominated the debate, and that makes it really hard for reasonable people to know how or if or when to engage. And making matters worse, right now our society is suffering from a really bad case of truth decay, making it near impossible to have a conversation about race and history. There's disinformation, misinformation, and a whole big dose of incivility. And so it's near impossible, in addition, to have a conversation when facts, when the idea of truth is up for grabs. It can make you feel sometimes like the fabric of our democracy is fraying, or worse, being pulled apart. But don't despair. I don't want to be a downer, and I hope to suggest a way forward. And I think history can help us. We're at a challenging moment in our country, but it's not the first, not by a long shot. The struggle for civil rights, for genuine democracy, where everybody is protected by the law, it's never been smooth in America, and it's never been linear. It has always been a push and pull, a series of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, progress, retreat, and ideally, when we're honest with each other and when we work together, progress. This is as true for the United States as it is for other countries. America has had brutal and painful periods in its history. America has had breathtakingly inspirational periods in its history. Both are true, and that is just a fact. For 200 years, some Americans relegated a people to the status of property. And yet, over most of that same time period, other Americans waged a vibrant abolition campaign to end slavery. The result? Progress. During Reconstruction, African Americans were able to exercise the rights of citizenship. They headed to state houses and Congress, started businesses, opened schools, and engaged in American life. It was a national rebirth of democracy. But this progress generated a backlash, a vicious campaign of repression by segregationists that included mob violence, terror, and Jim Crow laws. And then, through careful organizing, we had progress. In the 1950s, a civil rights movement with its brain trust here in this city transformed our country once again. That's the powerful story we tell at the center. It culminated in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, another rebirth for democracy. So that really means genuine democracy, where everybody has a voice in decisions that affect our lives. It's not really that old. In fact, it's my age, which I don't think is that old. That is history in living memory. So, will our next steps be progress or retreat? One challenge we face right now is that far too many people don't know our history, much less our full history. And how history is taught, what's included or not, has become a lightning rod. Every week, I talk to visitors who go through our exhibitions, and they tell me, I had no idea. I didn't know. That's why, and so that's one of the reasons we're making such a huge investment in education, to make the learning of history engaging. But historians will tell you, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And on civil rights, we will continue the same dance of progress and retreat over and over again. Same song, different verse, until we face our history truthfully and honestly. So as AJ said, I worked at the U.S. Holocaust Museum for 9 years. That museum was founded to gather the evidence of a mass atrocity crime. People had to gather the evidence because it was so atrocious, it was almost unbelievable. And in fact, people didn't believe. They tried to deny it. That still happens today, but much less so. To move on, history needs to be told and it needs to be understood. I believe Atlanta is a natural leader in this moment, based on our past and our present. And I think there are two important stories in our city that need telling. The first happened just a couple miles from here, in a beautiful new green space, Westside Park. It's the largest public park in Atlanta, with Bellwood Quarry as its centerpiece. Lots of us have heard that the quarry holds our emergency drinking water and has gorgeous vistas, and that is certainly true. Less well known is that about 130 years ago, Bellwood Quarry was a slave labor camp where many people were worked to death. Now, how was slave labor possible? The 13th Amendment ended slavery more than 130 years ago, but that amendment contained a loophole. Yes, slavery was outlawed, but anyone convicted of a crime could be sentenced to hard labor. Newly freed African Americans were targeted and arrested for petty or entirely bogus crimes, like walking on the grass or spitting, and then leased to wealthy farmers and factory owners. Unable to make bond, African Americans filled slave labor camps at Bellwood Quarry and the nearby Chattahoochee Brick Company. There were a steady stream of prisoners. Excuse me. The Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Slavery by Another Name, tells the story of this practice called convict leasing. The brick factory, as described in the book, was a place where people were worked to death and buried in unmarked graves. Guards from the brick factory, testifying before a legislative commission, said, prisoners were fed rotting and rancid food and driven with whips into the hottest and most intolerable areas of the plant. Those bricks built this city, but the story behind who made them and under what conditions is not well known. It's not taught in schools, and it's not talked about, even though it affected generations of people in this city. Here's another example, also drawn from Atlanta's past. Between Reconstruction and the 1950s, there were roughly 5,000 lynchings in the United States. 500 of those murders happened here in Georgia, part of that wave of terror after Reconstruction. The goal was to instill fear, so African Americans would be too afraid to vote or run for office or buy property or open businesses. 36 of the 500 lynchings in Georgia happened here in Fulton, including 2 massacres. You know, last year, many people learned for the first time about the massacre in Tulsa and the destruction of Black Wall Street. And similarly, many Atlantans are unaware that our city had a massacre in 1906. It started in 5 Points, really just a few minutes from where we sit today. The massacre happened during a governor's race where the candidates were trying to one-up each other with plans to disenfranchise Black voters. The 2 leading candidates were attached to newspapers, and they published a steady stream of false and misleading stories about Black men assaulting white women. All the papers in town did, trying to outdo each other with sensationalized reporting. They created a hysteria, and one newspaper called for vigilantes to punish Black men. And so a mob of 10,000 white men and boys killed at least 23 Black people over 4 days. African Americans were dragged out of shops and off trolley cars and shot dead in the streets and in their homes. The event, the 1906 Atlanta Race Massacre, is also largely unknown. even though it shaped our city. How could something like that be forgotten? A headline in the Atlanta Journal helps explain why. Atlanta is herself again. Business activity restored, and the riot is forgotten. It sure was. The Atlanta Race Massacre wasn't included in Georgia textbooks until 2007, more than 100 years after it happened. Teaching a fuller history in schools is a start, but schools are just one place we learn history. Our past is also conveyed in the landscape, in the form of place names, statues, memorials, and monuments. 2 years ago, the center started a project called Truth and Transformation to tell our fuller history about Atlanta in our shared environment, to help people explore what has been neglected by schools and forgotten in public memory. With it, we are memorializing the practice of convict leasing and the 1906 Race Massacre, and teaching about the Reconstruction era more broadly by representing these events in our landscape. This history is critical to understanding the civil rights movement that followed. It is a reaction to it. Just as this moment, in our moment today, it's critical to understand the civil rights movement. We get here through a past that is based on what happened before. It's essential to understanding where we are today and how we want to move forward. On the west side, we're working with a diverse group of stakeholders to commemorate convict leasing at Bellwood Quarry and at the site of the Chattahoochee Brick Company. In the case of the brick company, neighborhood leaders have long advocated for the site to be turned into a memorial. This year, the city announced it has purchased the land, and next month, Mayor Dickens will host an event at the site to talk about its future. So what would a fitting memorial to convict leasing look like? It's a great question. The center believes that no one person or organization can determine the answer to that for an entire community. So starting a year ago, we organized a group of 20 leaders to take up this question. These leaders are from the city, foundations, APS, companies, neighborhood groups, nonprofits, universities, and advocates who represent the descendants of the victims. This fall, we will begin engaging the Atlanta community to ask, what would a meaningful memorial look like? And we'll talk to Rotary to see how Rotary can participate in this information gathering exercise. It would be the first memorial to convict leasing in the country. And so once again, Atlanta can lead the way. In the case of the 1906 massacre, the memorial already exists. It's at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. I don't know if you all have been there. If you haven't, I highly suggest you visit. It's a stunning and powerful memorial. It contains 800 steel pillars, one for every county where lynchings occurred. Each pillar is etched with the names of documented lynching victims from that county. So this is Fulton's pillar in the memorial. It has 36 names, including the 23 from the Race Massacre. There's a large field next to the memorial with a replica of each county's pillar. That's the field. And there's Fulton's memorial in the field. EJI, Equal Justice Initiative, which created the memorial, has challenged every county to claim the replica of its pillar and install it somewhere prominent. Grassroots advocates in Fulton and DeKalb have organized coalitions to claim these monuments. We are working with those groups and a range of others to set the stage for its arrival with conversations, storytelling, and other kinds of public projects. We have partners at Emory who are investigating the lives of the massacre's victims and survivors and finding their descendants so we can learn about the impact of the massacre on their families and their lives. With other partners, we're writing curricular materials, creating walking tours, and developing an augmented reality experience. And we're working to make the anniversary of the event an annual commemoration. Next month will be the 116th anniversary of the massacre. To mark it, we are working with partners to host 5,000 people at 500 dinners across the city, all on the same night, September 18th. These meals, typically for 10 people, will happen in homes, in parks, in houses of worship, in restaurants, and offices. Larger venues like the Center and the Woodruff Arts Center and the Girl Scouts and the Y are hosting many tables. I just learned from Lauren that the Y is hosting 3 separate events. Each gathering will start with a 10-minute, one-person play about the impact of racial violence on our lives, and then guests will share a meal and connect with strangers and neighbors about ways they can make a difference. A facilitator at every table will help guide the discussion. We are asking each host to just organize the location and the food, and then we'll send an actor, a facilitator, and a diverse group of people to show up to every event. I hope many of you will join us next month by hosting a dinner at your homes or in your offices or attending one. Mayor Dickens will be at the Center's event. He'll be seated next to Pharaoh Allen, the 80-year-old grandson of Luther Price, a former postmaster in Atlanta and a survivor of the massacre. When I talk about this project, about truth and transformation, I am sometimes asked, why do we have to keep reliving the past? Can't we just move on? To answer that, I'm going to summon Benjamin Franklin, who once said, "Half a truth is often a great lie." I'll give you an example. English Avenue, one of the neighborhoods near the former brick factory, is named for Captain James English. He was a former mayor and a former police commissioner of Atlanta and a prominent businessman. Lots of people know those facts about James English. And in addition to a neighborhood, he is honored on schools and streets. But that's just part of his story. That's just half the truth. Because James English also owned the Chattahoochee Brick Company. Along with his other factories, English leased more convict laborers than anyone else in Georgia. We celebrate English, but we only know part of his story. We are left with some half-truths about the 1906 massacre as well. For example, in 5 points, right where the massacre started, there's a statue of Henry Grady, who is, of course, honored elsewhere around town. Everybody knows that Grady was a journalist and a great promoter of our city, but he also promoted white supremacy. In a speech, a typical one, he said, "The supremacy of the white race of the South must be maintained forever, and domination by the Negro race resisted at all points and at all hazards, because the white race is the superior race." When Grady was editor at the Atlanta Constitution, the newspaper not only condoned lynching and convict leasing, it encouraged these practices. So I have one more quick bit of history for you, and it's about the opportunity cost of half-truths. Statue of Liberty. So we all know the history of the Statue of Liberty. She was a gift from France to the United States to celebrate the friendship of our countries and to recognize America as a land of immigrants. Is that right? That's the narrative that was passed down, and it fits with what we'd like to believe, but it's just not accurate. Lady Liberty was created to celebrate the emancipation of African American slaves. A French abolitionist came up with the idea just after the Civil War. An early model, which has been on display at a museum in New York, has Lady Liberty holding the torch in one hand and broken shackles in the other. The statue took years to build, And as time passed, the creators decided to represent a broader idea of liberty, and they replaced the shackles with a book inscribed July 4th, 1776. The connection to immigration came a few years later when Ellis Island opened, and Emma Lazarus's poem was added a few years after that. So think about, how would we and the whole world view America and our history if one of our most iconic symbols represented opposition to slavery? We'll never know. But it is only by understanding our country's whole past that we can understand how we arrive where we are today, and then chart a reasonable and just path forward. Here's another way to look at it. Can you imagine going to your doctor, getting a checkup and a bunch of tests, and when the doctor came to give you the results, you said, just tell me the good news. Don't tell me anything that might upset me. You would never know how to get better. You would never heal. We're a society that is in need of healing. At the start, I told you about the push and pull of civil rights progress. In every instance, unfairness or injustice sparked citizens to work together, to use persuasion and facts and active civic engagement and conversation to change attitudes and policies. That's just how it works. That is always the best way forward. Dr. King famously said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." But that arc does not bend itself. It's up to us, especially the people in this room who are leaders, to lead the way in this moment for our city and for our country. I hope you'll join with the center and each other and our broader community to help create the next rebirth of our democracy as we strive to become a more perfect union. Thank you.
I just told Jill that doesn't happen all the time. So that's a big deal. So we have time for a few questions. I know we're running a bit over, but I wanted to open it up. And one of the first questions I have, which may be on lots of folks' mind, is it is uncomfortable and can be painful. So a lot of people have concerns about young people confronting pain and difficulty in hearing our history. How does the center help both educators and parents get past the discomfort to the truth?
I don't know if you can spare people the discomfort. You know, I think of it this way. If a friend comes to you and unfortunately says, "I have cancer," you say, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Now, you're not the cancer and you didn't cause the cancer, but you can feel bad about bad things that happen to people. And you can explain that that is a human response. You know, you hear, well, we don't want white children to feel bad. Well, I don't think they should feel bad because they're white. They should feel bad because they're human. And so there is a human response, and I think we have to get past this idea of personalizing these stories and think of it as the country of our country is our family, and we are all intertwined with each other. And people, when you hear these stories about people in the past, hopefully it makes you feel empathy. And if you have empathy for what people suffered in the past, perhaps it'll give us more empathy for what people are going through today. And I think that there's an empathy gap where we want to blame what's going on the people who are suffering it, rather than saying these are community problems that we all need to address and we all need to put our heads together to find common ground and common solutions so that everybody can be lifted up. And sometimes it's just recognizing that someone has suffered or is suffering. Recognizing that is one of the most important things you can do. And I think there's this blame game that goes on, that if I recognize I'm somehow going to be blamed for that, I think that's something we have to get past. And, you know, as a mom, I think it's important for kids feel, and kids know what's fair and not fair. They're, you know, they know that more than anybody. You hear from kids all the time, that's not fair, that's not fair. They know, and so I think if you take the time to say, this is what happened in our country's past, and it's up to us to do something different, to choose a different direction, that you'll get kids on board with that.
Any questions from the audience? Lisa?
Yes, I want to first thank you for an extraordinary presentation. So I want to first thank you for an extraordinary presentation. I'm very curious about a lot of things, but just in the immediate moment, the dinners. Any consideration for making certain that young people are at those tables, whether it's dinner at school or some capacity to do that? I just think that's just as equally powerful and necessary.
Yeah, so we are encouraging parents to do this with their kids. We've started our outreach to the schools to have schools participate in this. We have, through our educators, contacts with a lot of different schools, with APS and with others, and we've been organizing and trying to get people to sign up. We're using a special kind of software that when people sign up, we'll send you perfect strangers to your house if you sign up to host, and we're able to organize it so that it will be a diverse group. So Atlanta is in rooms like this, it's a very integrated city, in business, I think, in particular, but in many ways we still live very segregated lives. And it is important to have these conversations with a diverse group. This isn't about blaming and name-calling, or these are civic dinners. These are civil, this is a time for civil conversation and for people to really understand the human element of how our history shows up in our lives today. So yes, and if you have ideas about that, I would love to talk to you about it. Yeah. Yes, good to see you.
Again, thank you for an extraordinary presentation. As you were selecting events in Atlanta's past, I'm going to ask you, did you consider the history of zoning in Atlanta, because it particularly has great ramifications for today? And if you did, is there any sort of project in the center that'll talk about what is really an esoteric, abstract subject matter that really does impact the way we live together?
Yeah, if there is a particular, so I'm a newcomer to this city. I've been here 3.5 years, and I have not heard of a particular episode for us to hang that story on. If you have one, I would love to hear it. I think it's a part of the whole history we tell, and I agree that zoning and how we formulated our neighborhoods and where people live and all those decisions, there are some great books about that. I think it's naturally a part of these conversations, but if there's an explicit, this helps with storytelling. You know, to teach history really effectively, it's helpful to tell a story with human beings so you can dramatize it and make people connect. So if you have ideas about a particular instance in zoning history that we could use to exemplify that issue, we'd be really interested to talk about it.
Chuck, you had a question. Just talk loud.
I get to use my coach's voice. Kids will love that. Thank you for your courage and what choosing to introduce in the conversations, is there a parallel or an infusion of women's rights, sexual trafficking, things of that nature that gets woven into how conceptually those things get treated?
Yeah, it's a great question. Our first priority, so what we're doing on K through 12 education is building a portal. So I'll just be totally candid. We're stealing a page out of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's playbook. Schools in America don't think about that event without going to the Holocaust Museum's website or going to that museum. They are the premier educator. We aspire, and it won't happen overnight, to be that for the civil rights movement and civil rights history in our country. And so, as a first matter, you need to create materials that dovetail with the standards, because you want schools to use them. So we're first taking an approach that will insert these lessons at the appropriate moment when kids are studying them in school and when teachers need these materials. So that's the first piece. But as we grow, we want to also do a whole human rights component. Many people don't know what the difference is, or the similarities between human rights and civil rights, and so, or the history of how those two came to be separated from each other. And so we want to tell that whole story. And by building a portal, an online portal that people can come to, we will start to populate that over time. And unlike at the center, that real estate is limitless. So we won't have a cap on how much we can put on such a website. And so we will fill it as much as we can. But I think what is important, in addition to the breadth of the issues, is providing historical context on them. Because you have to understand the step that came before and the step that came before, because it gives a logic to the story. And we find that that's somewhat some of what is missing.
Well, please, Mayor Franklin, I can't say no to Mayor Franklin.
That's terrific, but I wanted to be sure that we acknowledge that the center is built on the land that was donated by the Coca-Cola Company, and several of the people here were instrumental in, it would not have been possible had it not been for
Thank you.
the company and Neville Isdell, who many of you know, and remember his leadership. It was not an easy road to get that, and I wanted to be sure of that. And there have been many other donors, but without the land, we would not be in downtown.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was an oversight on my part. Thank you to our friends from Coca-Cola.
Well, please join me in thanking Jill for such a brave and honest conversation, and it's hopefully the beginning of many more, and you will join the center for the September 18th dinners.
Yeah.
And Jill will be here for a few more minutes if anybody wants to come up and ask any more questions. We will see you next week. It's Dr. Lisa Herring, and it's kids, COVID, and the current situation.
Yeah.